right, everyone. This is Mr. E, also known as the Bearded Music Teacher, and I hope you enjoyed that little ad that I have been putting on my podcasts. It's involving Anchor. So if you are a fan of podcasts or you want to look into different podcasts, check out Anchor, or just rewind it and check out what I said. It's there. All right. So today, again on this podcast episode. We are going to check out Little Richard. So, in the past just a quick recap, the past two episodes, we've been talking about the first wave of rock artists. And before that, we did a little bit on the beginning of rock. So, we are now in that first wave of rock, that nice, good old, I guess you could say good old days between 1955 and 1959, 1960. And we're going to talk about Little Richard, as you see if you're watching the video. I have on the screen Little Richard and a slide for Little Richard. If you're using the audio version of this, you obviously don't see it. So let's look at some of the stuff that he was known for, a little bit of background about him as well. So his real name is Richard Wayne Penniman. And he recorded and signed with independent record label Specialty. He's known for Tutti Frutti, which climbed and crossed over from the R&B charts to peak at number 17. Long Tall Sally, which I believe in 1951 placed 4 on the R&B chart, maybe 10 on the pop chart. And he's very different from Fats Domino. And I alluded to this when we talked about Fats 2 episodes ago. And he has a way of playing where he's known as one of rock and roll's flashiest performers. And this is a real quote from him. He says, I mean Little Richard. I am an innovator. I am the originator. I am the architect of rock and roll. And his flamboyant piano pounding, wild sound in the mid to late 50s was a huge landmark thing for rock. He also is known for his vocalization with the woo, and I'm not talking about a Ric Flair woo. It's very, very I can't do it. You would have to go watch the videos or listen to him. It's all over his music. But he fused together the swing kind of feel of New Orleans R&B with gospel. And gospel does come into play here. He grew up in a poor family in Macon, Georgia. Poor and religious family in Macon, Georgia. And he sang gospel songs all through his childhood into being a young adult. He did perform with secular groups, secular R&B groups during the 40s. Some of them he drew influences on were Roy Brown, Billy Wright, and he really kind of drew from that stable of things. He also was very interested in the Chitlin circuit. Now, if you aren't familiar with the Chitlin circuit, I can't remember exactly what documentary it is, but they do allude to the Chitlin circuit. I believe it was with Jimi Hendrix. There's a documentary with Jimi Hendrix where Jimi Hendrix actually performed quite a bit and ran into, and I think he did actually perform at one time with Little Richard or one of the other predominant black artists or African American artists. Now, let's get back to this. So he was huge into that kind of idea, and he made his first recording for the Camden and Peacock labels in the early 1950s, performing in a solid but kind of derivative jump blues style. And by 1953, he was washing dishes in a bus stop in Macon, Georgia. So how did this dishwasher make his start? Like, how does he just jump into fame? Well, it didn't happen overnight. He kept on performing and doing things like that. Lloyd Price actually helped Little Richard get a deal with Specialty Label, the independent label Specialty, and he recorded with Rob Bumps Blackwell. He's not really too well known, besides the fact I believe of just getting Little Richard his start. So he achieved a breakthrough with Tutti Frutti, and um, that is the start. And that's why I tell my students that is the start for Little Richard. And he became one of the first African American performers to appeal to a racially segregated fan base, reaching number 2 in the R&B charts and then crossing over into the pop charts in both the US and the UK. So this is something that, again, is that we see the crossover. All right, a lot of times we see that crossover. And a lot of this happened with the fact that the white teenagers of the 1950s wanted to um, wanted to explore and wanted to become fans and eventually became fans of this R&B music, well, what was called R&B music, kind of like a subgenre of R&B music that became rock. And so that's where we see that. Now, it it's important to note that up until this point, we haven't had any UK crossovers with our performers of the first wave of rock. So that's something to kind of put your hat on there for a second and kind of think about that. Now, he did follow up right away with Long Tall Sally, Slippin' and a Slidin', Jenny Jenny, which that's another good one. It's a deep cut. When we talk about deep cuts, we're talking about not too many people look at that one. Jenny Jenny is something that is good. Keep a Knockin', which that's another one, kind of like Jenny Jenny. Good Golly Miss Molly is one that's all over the place. You'll hear that all over. And The Girl Can't Help It. So Jenny Jenny and Keep on Knockin', if you really want to dive it deep into that's one of the main hits, but it's further back in the catalog, meaning it's not on everyone's top lists of songs to play by Little Richard. And so at the height of his popularity, though, in late 1957, he just up and quit rock and roll. He was like, I'm done. Now, there is a story to it. He was in Australia, if I remember correctly. He was during an Australian tour, and something happened where he was on a plane. Now, this is based on what I've read and what I've heard in documentaries and things like that. So I have seen it a couple times. He was on a plane, apparently, had a really, really rough, turbulent ride. Of course, him being very, very, very religious, he prayed. Now, it doesn't matter if you're religious or not, this is what he did. He prayed, he made a deal. According to him, he made a deal with God that if God landed the plane, he would quit rock and roll music. And Little Richard took that as a sign. All right. Now, again, it doesn't matter if you're religious or not. That's just what I have read and what I've seen on different interviews and things like that of him and about him. So he just quit and just made some gospel recordings and toured as an evangelist. There we go. Wow, I'm having a hard time speaking today while I'm doing this. But then he returned in 1962, so it was a very short thing here. He jumped on board with a tour of Britain and Europe with the Beatles, and if you go to Rock Hall EDU, they do have, I'm pretty sure they have a picture of Little Richard with the Beatles, and at that point the Beatles were still fairly young in their career, because this is in right around 1962. This is very young, the Beatles, but they were still that grassroots. And the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were actually his opening acts, which is kind of interesting because they're kind of seen as like the good guys and the bad guys of the British invasion, happening a couple years after that. He continued to make new music with a series of different labels. He did do some recording with Jimi Hendrix but at that point, Jimi Hendrix was unknown as a solo artist or anything. And then he just he settled with a brief stint with his band, his backup band, the Upsetters, in 1964. In 1970s, early 1970s, he did revive his career for a little bit, and then he went back into the ministry with recordings and being a part of the religious side of his beliefs in the late 70s. There was an authorized biography called The Quasar of Rock: The Life and Times of Little Richard, and I believe that was written in 1950 or 1985. And then the following year, he actually was in a film called Down and Out in Beverly Hills. That's a great movie. It's got quite a cult classic following. And he did retire officially in 2013. And he did end up performing quite a bit in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. But then again, after 2013, he just was like, I'm done. So what can we go off of this? What can we know of Little Richard that we want to maybe explore sonically? I would highly recommend you start with Tutti Frutti. That's the first track. Listen to that. Then go to Long Tall Sally. And as you do those two things, compare that with what you've heard with Fats Domino. All right. And then when we get later on, we're going to compare Little Richard to Jerry Lee Lewis. But let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Good Golly Miss Molly is very long along the lines of Tutti Frutti, I believe, and Long Tall Sally. So those three really sound quite similar. And then I would end it with actually Jenny Jenny. That's where I would end up. So Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, Good Golly Miss Molly, and then round it out with Jenny Jenny. There are a couple things that you may want to explore. You may find a couple things later on in his catalog that's more modern, but those are the ones, the hallmark ones that you would want to check out. All right, so that wraps it up as a brief, short little podcast episode of Little Richard. Please share this podcast channel with other people. Share this. I believe I'm going to be posting this on YouTube. So find it on YouTube, share it with people on YouTube. This podcast is for educational purposes. This is the opinions of myself, Mr. E, the bearded music teacher, through the research that I've conducted, as well as pulling from various resources in preparation of doing these podcasts. You can also follow me on Twitter, which is, the handle is at MR_E_music FCS. And that will do it for today. I will see you all next time, and enjoy a brief little thing, as always, of a friend of mine, Taylor Shannon, performing the song September. That's if you're an audio person. This video is just going to end.